So let's have a bit of a blast from the past then. As it turns out, with Forge World rules, our dreadnoughts with 2 ranged weapons are still very much a current and deadly part of the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the Tactics and Strategy 40k channel, where we're all about trying to get the most out of our miniatures on the battlefield. We've been going through the Space Marines units and datasheets for the last few months, and today's video will be focusing on the Mortis Dreadnought. This is a Forge World datasheet that has pretty much the same stats as a regular Dreadnought, but has 2 sets of ranged weapons. It's a very solid, very strong unit, and in this video we'll be going over its datasheet, any obvious buffs and synergies for it, and which ways I would think about running it on the tabletop. In the past, the Mortis Dreadnought has been a pretty common sight for people converting Dreadnoughts with twin autocannons known as Rifleman Dreadnoughts. They were particularly popular around 5th edition, and it's actually only recently that the rules for the Dreadnoughts have been moved into Warhammer Legends, meaning that they're no longer advised for competitive play. However, the Mortis Dreadnoughts are still a very much current Forge World datasheet. I don't believe that they actually sell a specific Mortis Dreadnought, but some of the weapon arms are available from Forge World. This represents a perfectly bog standard Dreadnought, except that close combat weapon is replaced by a ranged weapon, and unlike on the standard datasheet, it doesn't have to be a missile launcher. So let's have a look at the options on the datasheet. So the Mortis Dreadnought is a heavy support choice for Codex Space Marines, and it costs you 60 points plus its weapons. It went down in points cost in the latest chapter approved to bring it in line with the standard Dreadnought, so I'd say it's now a very efficient choice for mounting a bunch of heavy weapons to. Its profile is exactly identical to the standard Dreadnought. It's got 6-inch movement, weapon skill and ballistic skill 3 up, strength 6, toughness 7, 8 wounds, 4 attacks, leadership 8, and a 3 up save. With its cheapest possible heavy weapon loadout, the heavy plasma cannons, it will cost you 92 points. And it can swap out those 2 heavy plasma cannons for 2 twin autocannons, 2 twin las cannons, 2 missile launchers, 2 assault cannons, or 2 multi-melters. It must take 2 of the same options. It can't mix and match, but in general that's usually a positive because it means that you'll be wanting to fire both of the guns of this thing at the same target pretty much all the time. I'd say its cheapest loadout with the plasma cannons is actually pretty solid. That'll be an average of 4 overcharged plasma shots, coming out of a 92 point vehicle with 8 wounds, which isn't really too bad for the points invested. You could have 3 of these loitering around the backfield, putting down a bunch of decent AP, decent damage, decent strength shots for the whole game, and I'm sure they'd do decently for their points. The main downside of the plasma cannons is that you're not going to want to move them at all, otherwise they'll be risking hurting themselves on much higher dice rolls, and they've only got so many wounds. You'll ideally want a source of reroll 1s to use these guys, whether that's Iron Hands and their Doctrine, a Captain, or perhaps Dark Angels and them Stand Still. The next cheapest is the Twin Heavy Bolter, which is just 1 point more per gun, putting your Dreadnought at 94 points for a Dreadnought that's putting out 12 bolter shots per turn. Again, that's not too bad a deal in pretty much any army. Heavy bolter shots will do decently against pretty much any target, but obviously Crimson and Imperial Fists are going to get the most benefit out of this, due to their extra hits on 6s with bolt weapons, and their unique Devastator Doctrine, meaning they'll be damaged 2 against vehicles, making it truly an all-round nasty gun platform with those heavy bolters. Very solid indeed. And again, very cheap. Our next most expensive loadouts will cost you 104 points. First of all, we have the 2 assault cannons, for a Dreadnought that's spitting out 12 strength 6 AP-1 shots at 24-inch range. Personally, for me, this doesn't really compete with the twin heavy bolters, as strength 5 to strength 6 doesn't usually mean a massive amount on most targets. You also lose a significant amount of range, meaning you might have to move your Dreadnought more, or put it in more harm's way of getting charged if you want to get close to your target. For me, the heavy bolters trump the assault cannons, mainly because they're so much cheaper. The other 104 point option is 2 multi-melters. Again, I'm not really the biggest fan of multi-melters, mainly due to their short range, meaning you'll often have to move the Dreadnoughts to take advantage of them, giving yourself a -1 to hit penalty. Usually the best use for melter weapons is in the Salamanders army when they have +1 to wound, which lets them better compete with las cannons, so it is one more place that you can cram in melter weapons if you are going heavy that way in a Salamander's list. I realised I told a lie earlier, in that there's another cheaper option on the table. You can take 2 missile launchers for a Mortis Dreadnought for 100 points. This guy's a decent little anti-tank unit, particularly if it's in Devastator Doctrine to make those missile launchers AP-3. Long range is certainly a great advantage of this one, particularly as the Dreadnoughts aren't really all that tough compared with tanks that are in the same points range, things like the Hunter and Stalker or Whirlwind for example. This is good because it means he can loiter at the back and hopefully be safe from a lot of enemy fire, and it's still quite cheap for 2 missile shots per turn. Moving on, we have your standard Rifleman Dreadnought. This is 2 twin autocannons, and this one will set you back 120 points. So this guy has 8 autocannon shots coming out of him each turn, and autocannons are good generalist firepower that will make a nasty dent in most targets, be they infantry or vehicles, and have a particular niche for shredding light vehicles. This is certainly a good place to get extra autocannon fire, and of course will perform particularly well if it's in Devastator Doctrine to get those low AP autocannons up to AP-2. A strong one definitely for Imperial Fists and Iron Hands. And finally we have the very heavily armed Mortis Dreadnought, who takes 2 twin lascannons for 140 points. Now this is some seriously efficient firepower point for point, as twin lascannons are very good value. He's a little bit weaker to enemy shooting than a quad las Predator, but he doesn't degrade, and is a bit more fighty in melee, and of course is quite a lot cheaper. This guy is definitely an efficient choice for getting mass lascannons into your list, though when you do overharm him this much, you do run the risk of losing quite a big investment when those 8 wounds go down. This one's quite a good synergy with the Iron Hands chapter, who can make the Mortis Dreadnought a character and allow him not to be targeted the whole game, because lascannons that you can't do anything about are very annoying indeed. He also has the normal explode special rule, and he can deploy smoke launchers if for some reason he can't target anything that's worth shooting in his turn. Worth remembering, but I don't suspect he'll use it very often. So overall, this guy is a very cheap gun platform dreadnought with remarkable flexibility in what armaments he can field. You can keep him very cheap, or mount some serious firepower on him, whichever best suits your army, and he can take virtually all of the standard weapons that Space Marines can be armed with. So let's take a look at any obvious buffs or synergies for this guy to let us get a bit more out of him. We'll rattle through the chapter traits first. As per normal, Ultramarines are great for moving and shooting without the heavy weapon penalty, and have strong character buffs. Iron Hands are obviously great for any vehicles. 6-up Feel No Pain, better Overwatch, moving and shooting for no penalty, and re-rolling 1s for heavy weapons are all enormously beneficial to this guy. And we have already briefly mentioned the ability to make him a character, which would make him a very annoying threat to the opponent's army that they need to either take out with sniper fire, which is unlikely to be efficient against tanks, or get close enough to shoot him or melee him when there aren't any other screening units in the way. I'd say that this is the single strongest way to field the Mortis Dreadnought, and if you're doing it, I'd give him some decently strong guns, either the autocannons or the lascannon. If you were going even further on this strategy, you could potentially give him the Iron Hands Warlord trait, targeting protocols to allow him to reroll a hit, wound and damage result every turn to make those lascannons even more brutal. Iron Hands of course have a lot of other ways to buff vehicles up, between healing them, giving them extra ballistic skill or many other special rules, so are generally strong for any vehicle army. Raven Guard giving him a 2-up save at long range would certainly help to give him the benefit of cover, and the stealthy trait can do this as well. Salamanders with Master Artisans will allow you to reroll a hit and wound roll, and will make any low-shot version of this dreadnought enormously more efficient, particularly things like missile launchers, lascannons, multi-melters and plasma cannons will get loads out of this. And of course, melter weapons are always great in Salamanders lists. We've already talked about the Crimson Fists and Imperial Fists, heavy bolter variant dreadnought, and adding a few of these to the gun line certainly won't do you any harm at all. The heavy bolter is pretty much the ultimate weapon of the Crimson Fists and Imperial Fists, as it benefits from all parts of their chapter tactic and doctrine, so this is a way to fit in another 12 heavy bolters on durable platforms for the very low cost of less than 300 points. That being said, the other loadouts certainly won't do bad for them with the +1 damage against vehicles, particularly things like the plasma cannons and autocannons, which will get a 50% damage buff against tanks, thanks to their very nice combat doctrine. Black Templar's best synergy is probably to use the Aurelian Shroud for a 4+ invul save for a turn to keep them safe, and they do have some decent chaplain listeners that can be used on dreadnoughts. Dark Angels and Deathwatch can both be useful for mortises as well, giving out some nice reroll 1s from their chapter tactics. To be honest though, whichever your chapter is, these guys are a very solid way of getting some more firepower in there for some cheap, uncomplicated extra guns. In terms of character synergy, obviously captains, lieutenants and chaplains will all be able to upgrade the firepower of these guys, and tech marines will be able to heal them. As is normal with dreadnoughts, there's plenty of stratagems that can be useful. Duty Eternal is the old favourite, particularly as these guys are quite fragile, but obviously if you're fielding multiples it might just make your opponent shoot at a different one and effectively ignore the stratagem. It's still very solid for just 1 command points though. Wisdom of the Ancients can also be good for getting reroll 1s if you don't have a source from elsewhere, and Big Guns Never Tire is certainly an option for moving and shooting a unit, as if you didn't move in the movement phase for heavy weapons. In general though, with these Mortis Dreadnoughts I wouldn't tend to spend too many command points on them. Even the very most expensive Dreadnought is a 140 point beast, and you might be better off saving your command points for bigger, scarier units. So how would I run these guys on the battlefield then? I honestly think that this is a really strong unit with multiple viable ways to field it, and I think that it's a lot easier to use than the regular Dread, as you don't have to think about getting into close combats to get the true value out of it. I'd personally be happy to field it with anything from the twin heavy bolter, twin autocannon, twin las cannons, missile launchers, or plasma cannons. The only options I'm not really such a fan of are the assault cannons and the multi-melters. This way you can pretty much tailor it to whatever you need, and whichever loadout synergizes best with your chap's tactics and other strategies. I would just be a little bit hesitant about fielding multiple ones with twin las cannons though, just because if they do get alpha struck off the table, you could potentially lose a massive amount of points investment for 3 not particularly durable vehicles. That being said, for the cheaper loadouts I'd certainly think about taking more than one of them. For threat saturation, meaning if the opponent can deal with one of them, they might not be able to deal with all 3. If I was playing with a few of these guys in a list, I would deploy them behind my lines, well screened from any opponent charges or any deep strike shooting that wants to come in and fry them. With the longer range variants, you could certainly afford to be very cagey, maybe even hide them out of line of sight terrain at the back of your board, and hopefully keep them safe at least for a turn. If I was going second, then I'd certainly try and keep them out of line of sight, and if I couldn't, then I'd think about using prepared positions to bump up their armor save to a nice 2-up. For the rest of the game, unless I was playing something like Iron Hands, I'd be trying not to move them too much once they've revealed themselves initially, as every time you move you are going to hamper your amount of damage output, so you'd have to weigh up the lost damage versus better positioning and potentially better lines of sight later in the game. From there, it's a very simple unit to use, just gunning down priority targets, while making efficient use of its guns, targeting the units it's most likely to be wanting to kill. One thing I do quite like is that, compared with a lot of other Space Marine vehicles, they're actually not awful in melee, with 4 attacks and strength 6, meaning they'll at least force a few saves if any light infantry get into close combat with them. That being said, you do want to still avoid close combat like the plague. Anything that stops these guys from shooting is going to be bad news. For specific chapters, my favourite ways to field them would be probably with the tried and tested Master Artisan's Stealthy Iron Hands combo, to give them a ton of rerolls, a consistent cover save, and also move, shoot and reroll 1s. If I was running them in this sort of list, I'd probably take one as a twin las cannon Mortis Dreadnought, and use that stratagem to make him a character and make him untargetable, unless he's the closest units due to being less than 10 wounds. I'd also absolutely love to test a few Mortis Dreadnoughts with twin heavy bolters in Crimson or Imperial Fists, as they'll be just some really solid, flexible battle line units. There are a few shooty Dreadnoughts that compete with this guy. Obviously the standard vanilla Dreadnought version with the missile launcher and twin las cannon basically allows you one version of Mortis Dreadnought, if a fairly rigid one. There's nothing particularly wrong with this guy at all. The Mortis Dreadnought just gives you a whole different level of flexibility. One advantage of the Codex Dreadnought is that you can make it a venerable Dreadnought for better ballistic skill and a 6-up feel no pain, which is a solid advantage, and probably worth the points if you are going missile launcher twin las cannon. Another solid competitor with this guy is the Contemptor Mortis Dreadnought, who has 2 extra wounds and a 5-up invul save, at a base cost of 88 points, where this guy is just 60. In general, I'd say that this extra investment is usually going to be worth it on higher value weapons like the las cannon loadout. In most situations, I think I'd rather have a Contemptor Mortis with twin las cannons for the extra 28 points compared with a Mortis with twin las cannons, though the character Mortis Dreadnought is certainly a unique selling point that the Contemptor can't do. For the cheaper options such as the heavy bolters or plasma cannons though, I think that the Mortis Dreadnought might win out, as you don't necessarily need to over-invest for defense for those cheaper guns. Overall though, I think that the Mortis Dreadnought is certainly a solid competitive choice for Codex Space Marines. And it's quite nice when you can get different use out of a Dreadnought model without having to do too much conversion work. If anyone's got any experience with using these mortises, please let me know down in the comments. And please correct me if you spot any errors in this video. Sometimes it does happen, particularly with Forge World, and how their rules marry up with Games Workshop's rules. Thanks for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to hear more like this. We'll certainly be covering more Space Marine datasheets in the future. Also feel free to contribute to my Patreon if you're getting good value out of my videos, as they do take quite a long time to make. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.